Her baby's life was slipping away, and no one could help, until a man she had humiliated stepped forward. The shocking act of kindness that followed left everyone speechless and changed her life forever. Comments below where you're watching from, and if you like and love our story, kindly subscribe our channel. Life, inspirational, and motivational tales that explore themes of love, unity, and patriotism. Stay with us always for interesting stories. Thanks. Let's start the story. Julia Carter echoed through the stark, sterile walls of the hospital's emergency room. Her baby lay in a fragile state, surrounded by a flurry of doctors and nurses speaking in urgent tones. "The baby needs a blood transfusion immediately," one of them explained. "The blood type is rare and our supply is empty. We'll need a donor." Clutching her baby's tiny hand, Julia felt her world collapsing. Her pleas for help seemed to dissolve into the frantic atmosphere, her desperation growing with each passing second. Around her, the waiting room buzzed with quiet conversations, none of them offering the solace she so desperately needed. In the corner of the room, unnoticed until now, Eric stood watching. The quiet black man had come to the hospital for routine tests, his demeanor calm and unassuming. But as he overheard the dire situation, his eyes filled with understanding. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos. "I'll donate. Test my blood." Julia looked up, her tear-streaked face freezing in shock as she recognized him. This was the same man she had insulted, belittled, and dismissed countless times before. Now, he was her baby's only chance. The weight of the moment hung between them, unspoken but unmistakable. The rain pounded relentlessly against the hospital's large glass windows, each droplet echoing the storm raging outside. Inside the emergency room, the atmosphere was equally tumultuous. Patients crowded the chairs and lined the walls, coughing, crying, and whispering anxiously to loved ones. The bright overhead lights seemed harsh and unfeeling, highlighting the worry etched on every face. In the far corner of the room sat Julia Carter, her pale face illuminated by the glow of the monitor attached to her baby. The steady beeping of the machine was her only source of solace, a fragile rhythm keeping her fears at bay. Julia's baby, Emma, lay unconscious in her arms, her tiny face motionless except for the faint rise and fall of her chest. Tubes snaked from her small frame to the machines surrounding her, each one a lifeline tethering her to hope. Julia's world had been unraveling for months. Left alone after her husband's unexpected death, she had struggled to navigate the weight of single motherhood. Her grief, paired with financial stress, had hardened her, filling her with bitterness. She carried that weight into her interactions with others, especially her neighbor Eric Johnson. He was everything she dismissed: kind, composed, and quietly impactful. Julia often directed cutting remarks toward him, her deep-seated biases clouding her judgment. "Always trying to be the hero," she once muttered when she saw Eric helping another neighbor repair a broken fence. "What's he trying to prove?" Eric had never reacted to her comments. Instead, he simply nodded or offered a polite smile before continuing with his day. His restraint only seemed to irritate Julia further, though deep down it was her own unhappiness and prejudice she battled. But none of that mattered now. Not her pride, her opinions, or her judgments. Emma's tiny fingers curled limply in Julia's trembling hands, and she knew she had never felt so powerless. A nurse approached, her expression professional but sympathetic. "Mr. Carter," she said softly. "The doctor would like to speak with you." Julia stood slowly, clutching Emma close to her chest. The walk to the consultation room felt like an eternity. When she sat down, the doctor wasted no time. "Your daughter's condition is critical. She needs an immediate blood transfusion," he explained, his voice measured but urgent. "What's stopping you?" Julia asked, her voice breaking. "Do it, please." The doctor hesitated. "Emma's blood type is AB negative. It's rare, and unfortunately we don't have any in the blood bank right now. We've contacted other hospitals, but time isn't on our side. We need to find a donor immediately." The words hit Julia like a blow. "How rare," she whispered. "Only about 1% of the population," the doctor replied. "Do you have family or friends who might be able to donate?" Julia nodded shakily and immediately began making calls. One by one, her phone calls ended in frustration. "I'm sorry, Julia," one friend said apologetically. "I'd do anything to help, but I'm not a match." Others didn't pick up at all, and each unanswered ring deepened her despair. Her hands trembled as she dialed yet another number, tears streaking her face. "Please, God," she whispered, clutching the phone as if it might hold the key to her salvation. But the response was the same. "I wish I could help, but I can't." Her desperation mounted, the fear of losing Emma overwhelming her. The nurses tried to comfort her, but their reassurances felt hollow. She stared at Emma's tiny face, her pale complexion a stark contrast to the vibrant child she'd known only days ago. Across the room, Eric Johnson sat in a quiet corner, waiting for a routine checkup. He had spent his life trying to make a difference in small, meaningful ways, volunteering, mentoring, and donating blood whenever he could. His calm demeanor and steadfast kindness had earned him the respect of many, though Julia had always been an exception. Her dismissive remarks and judgmental stares were familiar, but Eric had never let them affect him. He understood that people carried their own burdens, and he chose compassion over conflict. Eric overheard the commotion surrounding Julia and her baby. He couldn't ignore the strained voices of the nurses or the raw emotion in Julia's pleas. As he listened, the words "AB negative" caught his attention. His heart quickened. That was his blood type. He hesitated for only a moment before standing and approaching the front desk. "Excuse me," he said to the nurse, his voice calm but purposeful. "I heard about the baby who needs a blood transfusion. I'm AB negative. Test me. I'll donate if I'm a match." The nurse blinked, momentarily stunned. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with relief. "We'll get started right away." As Eric followed the nurse to the testing area, Julia looked up, her red-rimmed eyes meeting his. Her heart skipped a beat as recognition set in. It was Eric, the man she had mocked, ignored, and dismissed, the man whose kindness she had belittled, and now he was stepping forward to save her child. A wave of emotions crashed over her, shock, embarrassment, and a twinge of anger at her own helplessness. Her pride fought against her desperation, but it was no match for the fear of losing Emma. She wanted to say something, to acknowledge Eric's gesture, but the words stuck in her throat. Eric didn't look at her directly. His focus was on the task at hand. He calmly rolled up his sleeve as the nurse prepared to draw his blood. Julia watched from a distance, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. How could he be so calm? Why would he help her after everything she'd said and done? The weight of her prejudice pressed heavily on her, and for the first time, She saw Eric not as a target of her disdain, but as a man who was willing to save her child without hesitation. As the minutes ticked by, Julia remained frozen in her seat. A nurse approached her with an update. "The donor's blood is a perfect match," she said. "We're starting the transfusion now. This will give your baby the best chance." Relief washed over Julia, but it was tinged with guilt. She couldn't reconcile the Eric she thought she knew with the man who had just stepped forward to save Emma. She looked toward the testing area, where Eric was resting after the donation. His face was calm, his demeanor unassuming. There was no trace of resentment or smugness, only quiet determination. Julia clutched Emma's hand tightly, her tears falling freely. "Thank you," she whispered, though she knew Eric couldn't hear her. As the transfusion began, Julia felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in hours. But alongside that hope was the realization that she had been so very wrong. The man she had judged unfairly was now the only reason her baby had a chance at survival, and she knew she would never see the world or herself the same way again. Julia's fingers trembled as she scrolled through her contacts, her phone damp from the sweat of her palms. With every unanswered call and every softly spoken apology on the other end, her hope crumbled further. "Please," she begged into the receiver, her voice cracking. "Emma's dying. She needs AB-negative blood, and I don't know what else to do." The silence on the other end felt deafening before a familiar, hesitant response came. "Julia, I'm so sorry. I wish I could help, but I'm not a match." She hung up, her shoulders slumping as despair swallowed her whole. Julia's heart pounded in her chest, a painful reminder of the seconds ticking away. Her thoughts swirled chaotically. How could this be happening? Why her baby? Why now? She pressed her forehead against the hospital wall, her tears soaking into her sleeves as a nurse quietly approached. "I know this is difficult, Miss Carter," the nurse said softly. "We're doing everything we can, but we need to find a donor soon." Julia nodded numbly, unable to muster any words. She turned her attention back to Emma, whose fragile body lay surrounded by beeping machines and wires. The rhythmic hum of the monitors did little to soothe her frayed nerves. The baby's pale skin and stillness were unbearable, a constant reminder of the fragility of life. Eric Johnson sat on a plastic chair in the corner of the waiting room, his large frame barely fitting comfortably in the narrow seat. He was here for a routine follow-up, a minor inconvenience in an otherwise quiet day. His gaze wandered around the chaotic room, the worried faces, the hurried nurses, and the occasional cries of pain or frustration. But his attention soon landed on Julia, hunched over in her chair, clutching her phone as though it were her last lifeline. Her desperation was palpable, the raw emotion spilling from her every gesture. She looked broken, her once sharp demeanor dulled by an agony Eric could almost feel himself. He had seen Julia many times before, their lives intersecting in the neighborhood they both called home. She had never been shy about her disdain for him, throwing sharp words his way or pretending not to notice him entirely. Her prejudice had always been obvious, cutting, and yet Eric never let it bother him. He knew the world was full of people like Julia, and he had learned to meet their hostility with patience and grace. But seeing her like this, a mother on the brink of losing her child, shifted something in him. He couldn't sit idly by. It wasn't in his nature to turn away from someone in need, no matter their history. His eyes drifted to the flash of a weapon, a tang, standing by the railing. As he quietly observed the nurses whispering near the reception desk, one word caught his attention: Ab-negative. His heart skipped a beat. That was his blood type. He glanced at Julia, who sat slumped over, her head in her hands. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on him, and without hesitation he stood up and walked to the desk. "Excuse me," he said, his deep voice cutting through the noise. "I overheard you need AB negative blood. I'd like to donate." The nurse turned to him, her eyes widening in surprise. "You're AB negative?" she asked, her voice tinged with hope. Eric nodded firmly. "Yes. Please, test me. I'll do whatever I can to help." Julia sat frozen, her heart skipping as the familiar voice cut through her fog of despair. She turned slowly, her tear-streaked face locking onto Eric's calm expression. Recognition dawned on her, and a wave of embarrassment, shock, and something else she couldn't name washed over her. It was Eric, the man she had ridiculed so often. Her words echoed in her mind, cruel and cutting, each one like a hammer to her pride. "No," she whispered to herself, her lips trembling. How could it be him? How could he be the one stepping forward in her moment of need? The nurse led Garcias away to begin the testing process, and Julia sat paralyzed in her chair. Her emotions clashed violently: gratitude for his willingness to help, and a deep-seated shame for how she had treated him. She wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. All she could do was watch as Eric rolled up his sleeve, his quiet confidence unnerving her. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Julia wrestled with her emotions. A nurse eventually approached, her expression serious but calm. "Miss Carter, Mr. Johnson's blood is a perfect match. We're preparing the transfusion now. This is your baby's best chance." Julia's chest tightened, relief mixed with an unsettling sense of vulnerability. She nodded, her voice barely audible. "Thank you." She wanted to ask the nurse why Eric would help her after everything she'd done, but she couldn't bring herself to voice the question. Instead, she sat rigidly, clutching Emma's small hand, her thoughts racing. Why would he do this? What kind of person steps forward to save the child of someone who's done nothing but belittle them? When Eric emerged from the testing area, he looked exhausted but steady. He caught Julia's gaze briefly, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he took a seat back in the waiting room, calmly sipping the water the nurse had brought him. He didn't look smug or superior, just quietly resolute. The tension in the air was thick as the transfusion began. Doctors moved efficiently, their focus on stabilizing Emma. Julia stood by the bedside, her heart in her throat. She couldn't tear her eyes away from her baby, but every so often, her gaze flickered toward the waiting room, where Eric sat patiently. The sight of him filled her with a strange mix of emotions: gratitude, guilt, and a gnawing sense of regret. A nurse's words from earlier replayed in her mind. "This is your baby's only chance." The truth of that statement hung heavy, and Julia couldn't ignore it. Eric's act of kindness had become the turning point in her life, not just for Emma's survival, but for Julia's understanding of what it meant to truly see someone. As the minutes ticked by, Julia felt the storm within her begin to quiet. She had spent so much time judging Eric, holding on to preconceived notions that now felt so small and meaningless. And yet here he was, showing her a level of humanity she hadn't known she needed. She wiped a tear from her cheek and whispered to herself, "I'll make this right." For the first time in years, Julia felt the stirrings of change, a shift in perspective that would shape everything that came next. Eric sat in the sterile donation room, his arm outstretched as the nurse prepped him for the blood draw. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the machine and the occasional murmur of the staff. Eric's face was calm, his eyes focused on a spot in the distance, as if centering himself for the task at hand. Despite the gravity of the situation, he exuded a sense of quiet strength that felt unshakable. As the needle went in and the blood began to flow, Eric didn't flinch. The nurse smiled at him, impressed by his composure. "You're doing great," she said softly. Eric nodded, offering a polite, "Thank you," in return. Meanwhile, in the emergency room, Julia sat by her baby's side, her hands trembling as she adjusted the blanket covering the tiny, fragile body. The steady beeping of the monitors was both a reassurance and a cruel reminder of how close she had come to losing Emma. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of fear, relief, and something she hadn't expected: profound guilt. Every cruel word she had ever said about Eric replayed in her mind. The sneers, the sarcastic laughs, the judgmental comments she had shared with others in their neighborhood. They all hit her like a tidal wave of shame. She had seen Eric as less than, someone unworthy of her respect. Yet, in this moment of her deepest despair, he had stepped forward without hesitation to save her baby's life. She glanced toward the donation room, where Eric was still calmly giving his blood. His face betrayed no hint of resentment or bitterness. Julia couldn't fathom how someone could be so selfless, so forgiving, in the face of someone who had treated him so poorly. The doctors began the transfusion with steady hands, their movements precise and practiced. One of them turned to Julia, offering her a small smile. "The blood is flowing well," he said. "This is exactly what your baby needed. She has a fighting chance now." The words were a balm to Julia's frayed nerves. She clutched Emma's tiny hand, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. As the minutes stretched on, Julia found herself looking back toward the donation room. Eric was now sitting upright, sipping a cup of water as the nurse monitored him. He seemed tired but steady, his demeanor as composed as ever. The sight of him filled Julia with a sense of awe she couldn't quite put into words. When Eric finally stepped out of the donation room, the nurse approached Julia. "Mr. Johnson has finished donating," she said. "He's done this many times before. You're lucky to have someone like him nearby." Julia blinked, confused. "He's done this before?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Oh yes," the nurse replied, her tone warm. "Mr. Johnson is a frequent donor. He saved countless lives with his generosity. And he doesn't just stop there. He mentors at-risk youth in the community and volunteers at the shelter. Honestly, he's one of the most selfless people I've ever met." Julia felt her breath catch. The man she had dismissed as insignificant had been quietly making a difference all along. She had spent so much time judging him, belittling him, and yet he had been doing the kind of work that truly mattered. Saving lives, helping others, and building a better community. Eric approached Julia hesitantly, his tall frame looming but his expression gentle. "How's Emma?" he asked softly. Julia looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "The doctors said the transfusion is helping," she said, her voice trembling. "They think she has a real chance now. Because of you." Eric nodded, his face calm. "That's good to hear. She's a strong little girl." Julia's lip quivered as she struggled to find the words she needed to say. I don't know how to thank you," she stammered. "I don't deserve your kindness. Not after everything I've said, everything I've done." Eric tilted his head slightly, a small smile forming on his lips. "It's not about deserving," he said. "It's about doing what's right. Your baby needed help. That's all that mattered." His words hit Julia like a wave, their simplicity and sincerity cutting through the layers of guilt and shame she felt. She looked down at Emma, her heart swelling with gratitude and an overwhelming sense of humility. That night, as Julia sat by her baby's side, she couldn't stop thinking about Eric's words and actions. She thought about how easy it had been for her to judge him, to reduce him to a stereotype, without ever trying to understand the person he truly was. She realized how much she had allowed her prejudices to cloud her perception of others, and how much she had missed because of it. Looking at Emma, now stable and breathing more easily, Julia made a silent vow. She would be better, not just for herself, but for her daughter. She would shed the biases that had held her back and teach Emma to see people for who they truly were, not the labels society placed on them. For the first time in years, Julia felt a sense of clarity. Eric hadn't just saved Emma. He had shown Julia the power of compassion, forgiveness, and humanity. And for that, she would always be grateful. Julia paced nervously in the hospital lobby, cradling her now stable baby in her arms. The days since the transfusion had been a blur of relief, self-reflection, and a gnawing sense of guilt. Eric's act of kindness haunted her, not in a negative way, but as a humbling reminder of how wrong she had been about him. She knew she had to apologize, to acknowledge the depth of her misjudgment, and thank him properly. She spotted Eric sitting near the window, reading a newspaper. His posture was relaxed, his expression serene, as if he hadn't just performed an act of heroism days earlier. Julia took a deep breath and walked toward him, her steps hesitant. When she was close enough, Eric looked up and immediately noticed the baby in her arms. His face lit up with a warm, genuine smile. "How's she doing?" he asked, his tone gentle. Julia swallowed hard, trying to steady her trembling voice. "She's doing so much better," she said. "Thanks to you. The doctors say she'll make a full recovery." Eric nodded, his calm demeanor unwavering. "I'm glad to hear that," he replied, his eyes briefly meeting the baby's before returning to Julia. Julia shifted nervously, clutching the baby closer to her chest. "Eric, I don't know where to start," she stammered. "I've been replaying everything in my head, every insult, every time I dismissed you. And I feel so ashamed. I was so wrong about you." Eric's gaze softened as he watched her struggle to find the right words. "Julia," he said gently, "it's not about what's been said. It's about what we do when it matters." Tears welled up in Julia's eyes at his words. "But still," she insisted, her voice cracking, "I judged you so unfairly, treated you so horribly, and yet You, you saved my baby's life. I don't know how to thank you." Eric smiled faintly, shaking his head. "You just did," he said. "And honestly, I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because it was the right thing to do." In the weeks that followed, Julia couldn't stop thinking about Eric's words. She began to see her neighborhood and her community through a different lens. The biases and assumptions she had carried for so long began to feel like chains she had willingly bound herself with, holding her back from truly connecting with others. Julia started sharing her story with friends and neighbors, opening up about her experience and how Eric's act of kindness had completely transformed her perspective. "I was wrong," she told them candidly. "I let my prejudices cloud my judgment, and it almost cost me the most precious thing in my life. Eric showed me what true humanity looks like." Her honesty sparked meaningful conversations among her peers. Neighbors who had previously been indifferent to Eric began to approach him with newfound respect and appreciation. Julia watched as her community slowly started to change, inspired by the story of Eric's selflessness. One sunny afternoon, Julia decided to host a small gathering at her home as a gesture of gratitude for Eric. She spent the morning preparing, carefully arranging snacks and decorations while her baby napped peacefully in the next room. When Eric arrived, she greeted him warmly, her baby cradled in her arms. "Thank you for coming," she said, smiling nervously. "I wanted to do something to show how much I appreciate what you've done for me and Emma." Eric stepped inside, his demeanor as humble as ever. "You didn't have to do all this," he said with a chuckle. "I was just happy to help." As they sat down, Julia handed Eric a small, neatly wrapped card. "This is for you," she said, her voice steady but emotional. Eric opened the card, his eyes scanning the heartfelt note inside. It read, "You didn't just save my baby. You saved me from my ignorance. Thank you for showing me the true meaning of kindness." He looked up at Julia, his smile broad and genuine. "Thank you, Julia," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "It means a lot. We all learn and grow. That's what life is about." Julia watched as Eric gently held Emma, his calm presence filling the room with a sense of peace. She felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for what he had done, but for the lessons he had taught her. Lessons about humanity, forgiveness, and the power of simple acts of kindness. As the evening came to a close, Julia walked Eric to the door, her heart heavy with both gratitude and a lingering sense of unworthiness. "Eric," she said softly, "I'll never forget what you've done for me and Emma. You've changed my life in ways I can't even begin to explain." Eric nodded, his expression kind. "Just pay it forward, Julia," he said. "That's all I ask." As Eric walked down the street, the soft glow of the setting sun illuminated his figure. Julia stood at her doorway, holding Emma close, her heart full of hope and determination. She knew her journey toward becoming a better person was just beginning, but thanks to Eric, she had a clear path forward. The last page almost sent me over the edge. Thought I might fall over forever. In her reflection, Julia's voice carried a tone of quiet resolve. Sometimes, the people we judge the most are the ones who show us the true meaning of humanity. Eric didn't just save my child. He taught me the power of kindness and forgiveness. And for that, I will always be grateful. Julia's journey from prejudice to gratitude is a powerful reminder of the profound impact kindness can have on our lives. Her transformation resonates deeply with anyone who has ever experienced or witnessed the pain of judgment and the healing power of compassion. Eric's quiet strength and selfless act of giving remind us that true humanity lies in actions, not appearances, and that forgiveness has the power to bridge even the deepest divides. This story is not just about Julia and Eric, it's about all of us. It's a call to reflect on our own biases and to recognize moments where kindness has touched our lives or changed our perspectives. It challenges us to confront our assumptions and to see people for who they truly are, not who we perceive them to be. Have you ever experienced a moment where someone's kindness changed your life or your perspective? Share your story in the comments below and inspire others to embrace compassion and understanding. Together, we can create a ripple effect of empathy and change. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartwarming stories that celebrate the strength of the human spirit. Let's spread the message of love, forgiveness, and the power of a single act of kindness.